No food for 8 months? What am I, crazy? I mean, I might be a little crazy, but we definitely can't feed any of these rice fish for a super long time because it might make them really sick and probably kill them. But these fish are about to go on an epic journey where they actually don't go anywhere, but it will be a test of their natural survival instincts. We're gonna try our best to give them the best environment possible so that they can make it through the winter. With that being said, we gotta go back and talk about what is going on here. When September rolls around, it's time to start thinking about cleaning up some of the ponds, getting them ready for winter time. So on the big one here, it was mostly cleaning out all the Sylvinia that was dying off. And, you know, we're gonna go through and do some clipping on some other tanks as well. But one thing that we need to make sure is that the ponds that are gonna stay outside aren't gonna get totally rained on all the time. So for the 2-story aquarium, that meant moving it a little bit under the gazebo. And we actually had to do the first water change ever on this thing. It's been about 3 months since we set it up. We had to drain it down just to kind of slowly move it into the center part of the gazebo so that it doesn't get filled with water because we didn't make a drain hole. I think we actually did make a drain hole for this one, but I just don't want it to get rained on. The water temperature from the hose is basically the same as the temperature in this bowl, so we don't have to do anything there. Same story with the Platinum Medaka bowl. This one, I didn't need to drain it down to move it, which was kind of nice. And that leaves us with the Koi Medaka bowl. This one, I think we might, if we're gonna keep it out here, we need to move it a little bit more under the gazebo, but the more I thought about it, I figured, you know, we should probably move this thing inside. We'll talk more about why a little bit later. I'm sure you could probably guess. So I just drained a little bit of the water so it'd be easier to move, brought it into the corner of the fish room, little sneak peek there at some of the new tanks that we have set up. That's gonna be next week's video. Threw in just a drip drop drippy of dechlorinator and then filled it up. Again, the hose water should be the same as what's in there now, and it'll just sort of gradually acclimate to the room temperature, which is right now sitting about 78 degrees. So the main reason why we can't feed these fish at all for the next 8 months is because they're gonna be outside, because the water is gonna be so cold. Rice fish are similar to goldfish in that they don't have stomachs, they just have a long digestive tube. Their metabolism is temperature dependent, so if it's super freezing cold outside, then the food that they eat is gonna get stuck in their digestive system and just sit there, not do anything. That can cause disease. So when the temperatures get super low, like the upper 30s, as they will experience, they're gonna go down to the bottom, and they're certainly not gonna be eating even stuff around them very much. They might do that a little bit as needed, so that's why it's important if you're gonna keep these fish outside in the wintertime, you wanna make sure that there's enough depth to where obviously the whole thing isn't gonna freeze if you live in a climate that's that wild. And then also something like a planted tank or something that's just, you know, ecologically mature enough to have little bugs in the water. I mean, certainly microorganisms are going to be in there regardless, but they'll have to take advantage of that kind of as needed throughout the entire winter. And then of course their fat reserves, I'm sure that gets taxed pretty hard throughout the winter. But guys, I didn't just know all this stuff. I had to learn it, obviously, and I found a really great YouTube channel. I can't pronounce the name of the guy, but he's the type of dude where you can just tell he knows what he's talking about. And so I take pretty much everything he says as a fact. Pretty obvious this dude knows what he's doing. He goes by Medaka Metal on Instagram, I think, but I'll put a link to his channel down below. Go check it out if you're super into Medakas and you're like me, you're going through kind of like your first winter or, you know, whatever, whenever you see this video, if you're super into Medakas, you gotta check this dude out. So this pond over here is where we accidentally have a bunch of rice fish, and they come from me doing water changes on the little tubs inside. I would pour them in here, and then lo and behold, the ones that I missed, we have a bunch of really small ones in here. There's a couple that are a little bigger. My plan originally was to maybe put like a lid over this to help really prevent any of this from freezing, because I was thinking, like, you know, these are small fish, they would probably appreciate not having it being as cold. But I'm glad I started watching Metal Medaka's videos, because he basically told me that if we were to do even that, these fish are just too small to survive a winter. Like, probably all of them would die. Even though this thing is deep, and obviously there's gonna be a big gradient of temperature here, and my climate, you know, this whole thing would not freeze, not even half of this thing would even get close to freezing. It might go the whole winter without any freezing, but it's still gonna be too cold for these fish to make it. So we're gonna have to pull these dudes out, and we'll just put them inside in a specially marked tank that is just, you know, hey, we don't know if these are platinums or if they might be kois. There's a couple midnights in here too. They're just really hard to see because this whole thing's black. But yeah, just little tips like that, you know, you're not gonna find doing a Google search. You have to find it from somebody that really knows what they're doing on this super specific thing. I just keep learning stuff on the fly here. I'm very lucky to be hooked up with some experts in the Medaka world. So while filming this video, I reached out to my buddy Jackson over at the Medaka lair, and we were talking about temperatures and, you know, how long you can go without feeding these fish. And again, it's super relevant to that temperature. So on these days where it is like 65 in the water, as long as it's gonna be above 50 degrees for more than a few hours, you can totally feed these fish. And so that's kind of what I've been doing like throughout September without actually knowing what I was doing, because the temperature would get really cold at night, but the days they've been kind of warmish. And that's why all my fish, they look fine. They're not getting bloated because, you know, I'm not feeding them right before the temperature goes below 50. So when we have stretches of days where this water temperature is going to actually get up into the 70s, even though it's going to be low 50s and it might touch the high 40s at night, as long as we put a little bit of food in the, you know, early afternoon, then we should be all good. That should downgrade our time of not feeding the fish from, what did I say, 8 months to around 6 months, and it might actually be a little bit shorter than that if we decide to take advantage of these sort of like pseudo-warm fall days, and then obviously in the springtime as well. That is still a long time to go without food. Pretty remarkable how these fish can do that. I just spilled coffee all over myself. Not even gonna clean it. So the whole reason why I'm even entertaining the keeping the fish outside during the winter thing is because my climate is super similar to Japan's. Or so I'm told. I mean, I've never been there, but Japan is of course the birthplace of all of this rice fish stuff. That's what they do, and I'm trying to copy them. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we might get like a week out of the year. It's usually in December where it's like in the upper 20s, and that's the coldest it's gonna get. Like there's maybe a 50-50 chance every year that it's even gonna snow, which is weird because it rains so much. But yeah, so the deal is that the fish can tolerate the mid, even like the low 30s, because even if the top of the pond freezes over, you know, it's not below freezing down at the bottom, hence the reason for wanting to have kind of like a deeper sort of a tub, just something that's not super shallow that could completely freeze. And if you live somewhere like Minnesota or upstate New York or Canada, not the part that's like south of Southern California somehow, or you're in a place where like you know for a fact that if you put a 5-gallon bucket out, the whole thing's gonna freeze, then I mean, you're just kind of out of luck. So if you have a summer pond that you set up because maybe you saw one of my videos or somebody else's, and you don't know what to do, you know you can't keep it out in the wintertime, just take that thing, put it in your garage. Hopefully your garage has enough space to be able to do that, or your pond isn't like super big or anything, but that's I mean, your garage isn't gonna freeze, right? I think that's probably your best bet. That's what I would do, but we're gonna go for it this year. I mean, with rice fish, haven't ever done it before. This is the first time. I have done it with the minnows. Mixed success. I've been able to keep the populations that I have alive. They're just not built for this. The rice fish are built for this. So we're just gonna try and give them the best opportunity to have a really good winter, because the rice fish need to have a winter. They don't necessarily hibernate, they just kind of go into like a stasis mode, right? Like what I talked about with the Monte Carlo and the trees and the CO2, totally unrelated. It's sort of that kind of a thing where, you know, they're just hanging out, they're chilling, they're not moving a lot, you know, they can't really make use of their normal metabolism, so that's why they can't really eat. They're not gonna be swimming around all over the place using energy. They gotta conserve it, they gotta use up the fat stores that they have. But having this ability to go through this really hard, difficult season seems to be what gives them their longevity. I mean, if you're taking rice fish like what I'm doing with the koi's inside now, and you're breeding them in the wintertime, or you're breeding them basically year round, they're not gonna live very long. They might live a year, 2 years tops. That's what they say, but I mean, it definitely makes sense from a biological standpoint. The more energy that you're spending on doing something expensive like breeding usually means you're not gonna live as long. But yeah, that kind of wraps it up. I am now covered in cold coffee, so I'm gonna go deal with that. Keeping things in chronological order seems to be difficult for me these days, but yeah, we got the koi Medakas inside. I decided to do this basically because these fish were really expensive, and I think I want to continue to breed them a little bit. We're not going to breed them like permanently because I don't want to reduce their lifespans by too much, but I do want to try my hand at doing it inside. You know, I haven't done that. It's only been the outside stuff, and it was only this last summer. So I want to have the Medaka checking the eggs thing still in my life. and I just need more of these fish too. If you're unfamiliar with how these freaks of nature work, they're beautiful freaks of nature, but when these fish have babies, like 19 out of 20 of those babies are just gonna be all white. They're not gonna have this really cool orange head trait. That's why they're so expensive. They're like 3 times as much as a normal, like a platinum or a midnight or you know, whatever you find on a website. I'm not even sure if the babies that I have right now growing up are gonna develop this, and it might not be until next spring that I find that out. So I really just need to get way more of these fish to try and get like a few of them as adults, basically. Not sure if the potato is gonna live in here. I think it's probably, you know, it experienced the weather change, and I think it's trying to kill itself at this point. I don't know. We might need to make some changes here. I should have propped it up on something to make everything a little bit easier so I don't have to bend down. But yeah, I mean, if we're going for eggs and ease of breeding, then we definitely don't want anything in this tub, like not even the floating plants or anything that they could put the eggs on other than our breeding mops. But I don't know, we still have time to figure all that out. They're not just gonna magically, like a light switch, turn on and start producing eggs or anything, especially since we don't have a light. We should probably figure that out. Zooming back to the Costco pond that never was, we need to get these fish out of here, so just grabbed a little bin and filled it up with water. Pulling these fish out was pretty easy. There was probably like 15 of them in here. I think this thing is gonna stay here, and then next summer this is gonna be like the deformities bin. So when you're breeding a bunch of fish, you're inevitably going to have to cull a bunch of them, and I don't really like the idea of that. I'm kind of a wimp when it comes to that stuff. So this is, I think, where I'm gonna be putting all the fish that don't make the cut, that we don't want to be breeding in the population. That's sort of the rough idea, and that'll be next summer's problem. Since we got lucky and we're about to have like consecutive days in the 80s here, I think this is one of the last good opportunities for our fish to really feed and get ready for the winter. So I'm gonna start every kind of in the late morning with a really heavy feeding, and we're gonna go with frozen baby brine shrimp cubes, as well as some legit nano, because it has so much of that good fat that I think these guys are really gonna need for the winter. The baby brine shrimp cubes are also really good for this. They have a variable amount of fat because, I mean, every little shrimp is gonna be different, but they can have up to almost 20%. And the legit fish food is just really good because it also has a high protein content and it has like 9% fat, which is a lot for a pelleted food, and it's just the best combination of the best types of fats. We should be okay doing this because it only takes a few hours for the rice fish to digest their food, so if I do my feedings in kind of like the late morning and then maybe another one in the afternoon, as long as it's at least a few hours before the temperatures start getting down into the low 50s, we should be okay. Another little piece of advice that I got from my buddy Jackson at the Medaka lair was that if your window is shorter than what mine is, and you're concerned about the digestibility of the food, you can go with something that's a little lower protein, kind of the opposite of what I'm feeding, and that's just gonna mean that the fish can digest the food faster, and you're not gonna run into issues if your time window is really tight. But I don't think it's that big of a deal. Like, only feed if you know that everything's gonna be okay. And again, this is me kind of speculating here, but I just think that, you know, you're probably not gonna have too much of a problem as long as you don't feed a ton of food. And yeah, I'm basically just doing the same thing with the goldfish that I have. I threw in a bunch of this random junky food just to try and get them to eat. They're super finicky. They won't come up to the surface and eat, especially when I'm anywhere near this thing. But same story, just trying to get them to eat a little bit before it gets too cold, and they're not gonna be eating anything for like 6 whole months. So yeah, guys, that's the story of no food for a super long time. Here's a little sneak peek at the main tank in my basement. That'll be next week's video. If you wanna support the channel, check out this sticker store. It's the best way to help support what I'm doing if you like the videos, and also get something really cool in return. Or you can just go straight to legitfishfood.com if that makes more sense and you don't want stickers. Thank you so much for your support, guys, and we'll see you next week.